श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः हरिः ओम् आप्यायन्तु ममाङ्गानि वाक्प्राणश्चक्षुश्रोत्रमथो बलमिन्द्रियाणि च सर्वाणि सर्वं ब्रह्मोपनिषदं माहं ब्रह्म निराकुर्यां मा ब्रह्म निराकरोत् अनिराकरणमस्तु मनिराकरणं मेस्तु तदात्मनि निरतेय उपनिषत्सु धर्मास्ते मयि सन्तु ओम शांति 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 हरिः ओम तत्सत्. Namaste and welcome to the last day of this memorable seminar. Today we have many prominent speakers. The fifth academic session is chaired by Professor Sati Chatterjee, former professor of English, Jadavpur University. And today we have two speakers in the fifth academic session. Professor Anandavidya, San Jose State University, USA. And Professor Rupa Bandyopadhyaya, professor of philosophy, Jadavpur University. I think Professor Rupa Bandyopadhyaya is on the way, but still we have started because time is precious. So I request Professor Sati Chatterjee to take charge. Namaste.
Pranams to the Holy Mother, Thakur Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Bhagini Nivedita. Good morning and namaskar to everyone. We are beginning the fifth academic session, and the focus in this session is on dialogue between the Indian and the Western systems of thought, modalities of perception, etc. We have eminent speakers in this session. The first speaker is Professor Anandavidya from San Jose University, and he speaks on perception and panpsychism, Nyaya, and the Vedanta philosophy in conversation with analytic philosophy. We are eager to listen to him. Professor Bodho.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. Because of our time, I'm going to try and jump right into the talk, but let me begin by thanking everyone at the Ramakrishna Mission for inviting me, and especially to my mentors, Professor Bilamoria and Professor J. Shankar Lal Shah. So today, what I want to do is I want to put into conversation two groups of people that I see in philosophy. So one group of philosophers comes from the Anglo-Austro-American analytic tradition, and they are very prominent people. They are Timothy Williamson, Tyler Burge, David Chalmers, and John McDowell. And these people I want to put into conversation with very prominent Indian philosophers, J. Shah, Purushottama Bilamoria, Janardhan Ganeri, and Arindam Chakrabarti. And these are just some of the people that I want to put into a gigantic conversation with each other, because for the most part in the world, you don't see them really talking that much, or you don't see their work engaged constructively, and that's the goal. So you might wonder why I want to do that. Well, one reason for wanting to do that might be very well what Professor Shah spoke to us about on the first day, is that you think that there are problems in one tradition that can be solved by looking at tools in another tradition and vice versa. But there might be other motivations. You might think that certain problems in philosophy are simply frame dependent, and that by exploring other traditions we can come to see frame dependency of problems. And there might even be a third motivation to do this. You might think, who cares about the problems? Who cares about the frame dependency? I like making interesting conversations happen because I want more people to know about philosophy. And in this sense, I'm speaking to the public more than I am speaking to the academics. That is, I think it's very important to get philosophy into the public space more, and I think one way to do that is to construct very engaging conversations. So I have built my own model of how to do this, and I have defended it in a paper. It's called ACE Philosophy, because it stands for the combination of analytical, comparative, and experimental methods. And by analytical, all I mean here is that there must be some analysis. I don't mean that there is anything particular about analytical philosophy as it's practiced in Britain or the United States or Australia. I just mean simply analysis. That's all I mean. And by comparative philosophy, I'm not restricting it to any specific cultures or traditions. And by experimental methods, I'm surely not restricting it to the methods that Amita Chatterjee was talking about in experimental philosophy. I'm opening it up to investigation in neuroscience, physics, mathematics, and all sorts of disciplines and domains. But the idea is to combine these three things together to produce philosophy. So the setup of the talk is that I want to begin by talking about perception and knowledge today, primarily because this is the work that I'm currently working on with Professor Shaw. And if we have time, I'm going to focus then back on mind and reality, the panpsychism part, because that's work I've already done with Professor Billamoria, and there's continuing aspects of it that we can talk about today. But the main setup will be that I will begin by talking about a set of issues in analytical philosophy, closing with how the Nyaya could contribute to this conversation in a very forward-looking way. That's the basic goal of the first part of the talk. And in the second part, the setup is exactly the same. Go through a bunch of moves that are going on in Western analytic philosophy and show how there can be moves from Indian philosophy that interject right into that place. That's the basic structure. So in perception, there are various theories that get floated around. My focus will be on two specific theories. One is called anti-individualism, and the other one is called disjunctivism. And by focusing on these, I'm not saying that they're correct. What I'm doing is I'm constructing a conversation because these are very prominent views in Western analytic philosophy. There are other views of perception that are very interesting also that are focused on by Buddhist philosophers and neuroscientists, and I'm not going to be talking about those. I'm going to be focusing instead on these. Okay, so in perceptual theory, it is very typical to begin by talking about the differences between the veridical cases and the non-vertical cases. And by saying that, we mean that there's something like a good case and a bad case. And many of us in philosophy are familiar with what the word veridical means, but a lot of what this talk actually will end up being about is my skepticism that we really understand veridicality at all. I'm very skeptical about veridicality these days, and I don't even know if there are any vertical perceptions at all. But we have to begin with where everyone usually begins, and that's here. So there's a good case and a bad case. So let's just get clear about what that really means. The good case that everyone wants to talk about is a case in which there is no biological malfunction on the side of the perceiver, there are no environmental distortions, and there's a right kind of connection between the perceiver and the world. That's basically the profile of the good case that can be used across these different cultural discussions of perception. Then you can get to bad case number one, which is basically that there is something going wrong, and what goes wrong is basically on the part of the perceiver. So we say there's some sort of biological malfunction on the part of the perceiver. Everything in the environment's okay, but something's wrong with the perceiver, and that's why we get some sort of non-vertical perception. In the third kind of case, what we get is the opposite profile. Everything is okay, pretty much, with the person. There's nothing, no biological malfunction, but something's wrong with the environment. There's lots of ways the environment can go wrong, but the general profile is that it's on the environmental side, not on the subject side. Oh, okay. Okay. Then the final case is called the hallucination case, and it's a bad case also. The difference here is that we don't really say that there's an environmental problem. We don't really say that there's a biological problem. But as we typically do in certain kinds of philosophy, we try to sort of construct a hypothetical case, and then we say about the hypothetical case, how would it interact with the theoretical discussion we're having? So the hypothetical case that's going on here is basically an artificially induced hallucination. That's the profile of this typical case. And later on, when I talk more about the Nyaya theory, I will put pressure on the coherence of discussing these hyper-theoretical cases. But for the purposes of having a exhaustive taxonomy, we have these four cases. The good case, then three bad cases, and from now on I'm probably just going to talk about them as just the bad case and the good case. Okay? So, within analytical philosophy, in the history of the 20th century and going even farther back into modern period, there is something that has come to be known as the highest common factor view of perception. And the basic idea is that when you have a good case and a bad case, and from the first person point of view you can't tell the difference between the good case and the bad case, you have to put yourself in the position of realizing that for all intents and purposes, the kind of experience you're having provides you with the same sort of justification, warrant, or evidence. That's the idea. If you can't tell the difference between the good case and the bad case, then your evidence in both cases is the same. That's the basic idea. And this idea was articulated very strongly by A.J. Ayer in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was argued against by J.L. Austin later on. So it's a very common debate in analytical philosophy to talk about this position. Here's one way to see it. What's the difference? You're having an artificially induced hallucination, and you're having the actual case in which you see the lemon on the table. You can't tell the difference, so from a certain perspective, the evidence is basically the same. That's the highest common factor view. And this view, from the Cartesian framework going forward in Western philosophy, has been a very dominant view. It's been very hard to take down, and it's held a very privileged position. But not too long ago, some philosophers working out of England came up with a sort of strategy of responding it, and it's called the disjunctivist response. And this builds a different type of perceptual theory. So this perceptual theory basically wants to say the following. Perception is a capacity for knowledge. Perceptual appearances are metaphysically distinct. Perceptual appearances have asymmetric warrant. And perceptual experiences are non-factorizable, or a perceptual experience can't be factorized into its different components. But if you want to see what's going on in relationship to the other view, the way to see it is in terms of the core claim that it's making. What it wants to do is it wants to deny what's called the common kind assumption. It wants to say, who cares if these two states feel the same from the inside? Why should I believe that they are the same just because they feel the same? And now you might be like, well, Anand, obviously you want to do that because your evidence is the same. So how do we put some sort of intuitive weight behind forwarding this view? Well, here's a way to do it. This is the way I think about doing it. If you think about jade, there was a time period where we thought that jade was one kind of thing. And then scientists did some sort of investigation to discover that its microstructure was different. So from one perspective, jadeite and nephrite are in fact the same thing from the perspective of just looking at their macroscopic distinguishability. But from the microscopic level, they are distinguishable. So then the question becomes, what's the one that's important for individuating the kind of thing we're thinking about? What is the thing we want to individuate with? Do we want to individuate at the microstructure, or do we want to individuate at the macrostructure? Okay, well, if you take it that way, then there could be a similar sort of argument to be made. You could think, well, perception is a natural kind of event in the world. Right? And there are good cases and bad cases. Sure, at a certain level of description, they are indistinguishable. And sure, from that perspective, they should be treated the same. But is that the relevant perspective that we want to look at them from? Some people, the disjunctivists, would say no. What they want to say is there is a difference. There's a good case and the bad case. Right? And what's relevant for distinguishing them is the good case and the bad case part, whatever makes it a good case and whatever makes it a bad case, not the fact that they're first-person phenomenologically indistinguishable. Okay? So the fact that you can't tell them apart, the disjunctivist says that's not relevant. What's relevant is the individuating aspect of what makes it a good case and what makes it a bad case. Okay? So that's the disjunctivist response to the highest common factor view. Now, coming from a different direction, there's another move called anti-individualism. And the basic idea of anti-individualism is that there is an idea that in order to have perception in the first place, you must have some veridical perceptions. The idea is that the perceptual system requires, in order for it to have representation, that there is some vertical perceptions that make it the case that you have perception at all. One way of cashing out this aspect of perceptual anti-individualism is by talking about the notion of asymmetric dependence. And the core idea there is that truth and falsity are asymmetrically dependent. In order to have a false cognition, you have to have a true cognition first. But to have a true cognition, you don't have to have a false cognition. There's an asymmetric dependence. Okay? So anti-individualism favors this idea of asymmetric dependence. Okay? Oftentimes, what's related to anti-individualism is a very important thesis, and that thesis is called the proximality principle. And basically the idea is that when you think about your perceptual states, you have to realize there's something going on from the perceiver, from the retina in. Okay? And what they want to say is that the proximality of what's going on in the retina at the processing level is the relevant place of individuation. So if at the retinal level you can't tell the difference between the good case and the bad case, then there is no difference to really care about. The proximality principle is saying that when you individuate perceptual kinds, you have to do it proximally, not distally, but proximally to the subject. And the proximality is operating at the retinal level and then internally. Okay? So if you want to see a nice way to see the difference between the two, anti-individualism is basically saying that the good case and the bad case have to be treated the same because of the proximality principle. And the disjunctivist is saying that the good case and the bad case have to be treated differently. And then the question is, why should they be treated differently? And how do you defend the idea that they should be treated differently? Okay? Now, anti-individualism does not fit well with disjunctivism within Western analytic philosophy. These two camps are very much opposed to one another. So the anti-individualist basically thinks that the disjunctivist is wrong for one reason. The proximality principle is basically an enshrined and encoded idea in vision science. Tyler Burge often argues that within the vision sciences, everyone accepts the proximality principle. If disjunctivism is inconsistent with the proximality principle, there's no reason to take it seriously because it could never contribute to a correct account of perceptual processing. So that's the basic argument. Now, of course, in order for that argument to hold, the proximality principle has to be true. So later on in this talk, I'll actually argue that the proximality principle could be false. And I'll give some evidence for that from John Campbell's work. But for now, I want to put it on the table as showing you the dialectic. There are these two positions, disjunctivism and anti-individualism. They fight with one another. And now we're trying to find some way to have a conversation with that through Indian philosophy. So when I first started on this project, actually, it was because Dr. Bilamoria had invited me to start thinking about perception and Indian philosophy. And so I started reading a bunch of papers, reading some papers by Dr. Shaw, and working on these ideas more and more and developing some thoughts. And I eventually found that there was a debate already in play between people like Stephen Phillips and Othel Matthew Dosti, and that this debate was going on with Janardhan Ganeri about some issues that seemed very closely related to the debate that was going on in analytic philosophy, which made me start to think there's a way to have these two camps interact with one another. Okay, so what's the debate that's going on within contemporary Indian philosophy? It seems like it surrounds Gangesha, and the idea is basically this, that Gangesha is some kind of naturalist, and he's also an infallibilist. And Ganeri argues basically that 1 and 2 are inconsistent, and Stephen Phillips and Matthew Dosti argue that 1 and 2 are conceptually consistent, and that 2 is true for Gangesha. Okay? So let me show you a passage that actually Stephen Phillips put in one of his works that actually really influenced me and started me thinking more about Professor Shaw's own work and how to relate all this stuff back to analytic philosophy. Here's a core passage from Stephen Phillips. A non-vertical perception is not really a perception at all, but a pseudo-perception, a pratyaksha abhyasa, apparent perception, a perception imitator or perception solely from a first-person point of view. You don't really see an illusory snake, you only think you see one. An apparent perception P may be indistinguishable from the subject's own perspective from a bit of genuine perceptual knowledge P, but both forming A as F type dispositions. But Nyaya insists they are different, taking a disjunctivist position. So in fact, Stephen Phillips himself, when he was reasoning through this stuff, sort of saw that there was some kind of relationship between the work going on in analytical philosophy and his own interpretation of Nyaya. And I picked up on this and started thinking, oh, what could be going on here? Okay, so there is a contribution that we can make going from the direction of analytical philosophy into the debate between Ganeri and Dosti and Phillips about Gangesha. And that is, within analytical philosophy, there's already a debate about the nature of whether fallibility is consistent with epistemological naturalism by thinking about the idea of what fallibility is. And there are two views. One is called the capacity view. It says that if X is in a good case and sees a yellow lemon on the table successively, then X could not be in error about what they see. This is contrasted against the exercise view, which says if X is in a good case and sees a yellow lemon on the table successfully, then X could be in error about what they see. Now, these two things can sound like they're saying the same thing, but they're actually saying something very technically different. So let me give you the example that they use. Suppose I'm on a basketball court and I shoot a free throw, and I make the free throw. The capacity view says you're getting it in means you couldn't have got it wrong. The fact that you got it in means you couldn't have got it wrong. The exercise view says even though you got it in, you could have got it wrong. What's happening is the modality, could have, is being located in two different places and qualifying. One is qualifying the capacity, and one is qualifying the exercise of the capacity. So I have a capacity to walk. This is an exercise of that capacity. Okay? The exercise has one modality, could have failed. The capacity has another modality. And so they're debating right now this issue. And in fact, at the APA coming up in America, in the Pacific APA, there's going to be a further discussion of perceptual capacities precisely because this is a very interesting debate. So this issue actually triangulates right into the area where Ganeri, Phillips, and Dosti are arguing. And I wonder, actually, do the Nyaya actually have their own understanding of what the fallibility would be, such that we can generate the Nyaya view and intersect it between the exercise view and the capacity view and engage a debate right here between Nyaya, perceptual capacity fallibility, and what's going on here. Of course, I haven't worked out this component, but my hypothesis is that there is something within the Nyaya that speaks to this debate in the analytical tradition. Okay, so another component of what has motivated me in this discussion is that there's an important philosopher in America, Matthew Dosti, who has been arguing about this relationship between disjunctivism and Nyaya. And he had this very important passage that influenced me to think a lot about these issues. So I want to read it to you. There are enduring insights in the Nyaya view that anticipate and speak to contemporary developments and that may be mined for further contributions. Moreover, the Nyaya position exists at all is useful for contemporary disjunctivism, as it gives support to the contention that disjunctivism need not be seen as a mere reaction. It may be motivated independently, as seen in a tradition never set against a dominant Cartesianism, but ever ready to challenge its presuppositions. In other direction, I think that the parallels with disjunctivism set an agenda for further Nyaya research. Its approach to knowledge seems to resemble aspects of the disjunctivist position, and tracing its development along those lines would, I think, illumine the cohesion of its core epistemological commitments. I agree with Matthew. I think that this is a very interesting thing to pursue, and that's why I'm pursuing it. And I think actually Professor Shaw's own interpretation of Nyaya perceptual theory has something very important to add in the area where Matthew has set up the agenda himself. So that is what I'm pursuing, basically. So let's now look at the question that Matthew's work raises in a very pressing way. Are they really disjunctivists? And I think there are two different issues that we have going on here. One is that, as I've set things up, there are two different issues. There's asymmetric dependence, and there's disjunctivism. Those, in fact, are not the same thing. And then there's a further issue. As Professor Shaw pointed out in his keynote address, it might be incorrect to think that the taxonomy that's available in Western analytic philosophy helps us really get clear on what's going on in Nyaya perceptual theory. As a consequence, we might look at this taxonomy and find that when we articulate what the Nyaya view is, it breaks the relevance of the taxonomy. So that's a move I want to leave on the table to be made. I don't want to say that that's not the correct move to make. But given that Matthew has set up an arc, I'm just following within that arc, basically. Okay, so these two things are, in fact, not the same. So there is evidence for asymmetric dependence in Nyaya. I think Matthew has actually written a very nice paper in 2012 in Philosophy East and West where he basically proves that point. There's evidence for disjunctivism. I think I just showed that with a passage from Stephen Phillips from his 2012 book. But there are some analytical issues here, and not analytical in terms of analytical philosophies, but just conceptual issues going on here. I already wrote a paper defending the claim that asymmetric dependence is not disjunctivism. In fact, those two things are not the same thing. And then in another paper that I wrote for a Festschrift for Dr. Shaw, I defended the idea that M disjunctivism is not the same as E disjunctivism. And there are various people in the United States and UK who have defended this view and are writing dissertations on this very issue. One of them was working with Laura Guerrero at the University of New Mexico. Her name is Krupa Patel, and she's working on this issue within analytical philosophy. And it's very interesting stuff that's going on there. So now let me intersect what I think is going on the Nyaya side. So what I think is going on, basically, is that there is, in Nyaya perceptual, in the analytic terrain, there is a metaphysical view that basically says that the good case and the bad case are distinct at a metaphysical level. Okay? And then there's another one called E-disjunctivism, which says the good case and the bad case are not different at the level of processing, but their level in terms of what they normatively give us in epistemology. The good case gives us real evidence because you're getting it right. And the bad case doesn't give you evidence. But what's going on is not that there's a distinction at the metaphysical level or processing level, but at the epistemic level, the evidence I have. In the good case, I have evidence that gets me somewhere. In the bad case, I don't. And that's an epistemic point, not a point about processing. Okay? So these two things are not the same thing. There's lots of good arguments in analytic philosophy to show they're not. And my own understanding of Dr. Shaw's work is that within the view of the Nyaya, there's something that I think I could call causal disjunctivism. And that idea is basically focusing on the fact that you can individuate the good case and the bad case not by thinking about veridicality, but by thinking about the causation that produces the veridicality. Okay? So how do you see this analytically? You see it with this diagram. The view that these two states are metaphysically distinct that the disjunctivist argues for can be argued for in two ways. Right? Jadeite and nephrite are different microstructurally, but at the macroscopic level, they look the same, right? The good case and the bad case look the same. One way to say that they're different is because one is true and one is false. That's called the veridic individuation. To say that the good case and the bad case are different because of the truth is to say that what makes them at the micro level different is the truth aspect. The other way of cutting them apart is to say, no, it's not primarily truth that individuates the two states, but it's the causal processing. The causal processing that goes on in the good case is different than the causal processing that goes on in the bad case. Now, truth might be a consequence of that, but the primary individuator is not truth. The primary individuator is causal differentiation, right? Now, this is a view personally that, from my own training in philosophy, I find very, very hard to believe. But the more and more I've come to understand my own misunderstandings of what's going on in Indian philosophy and how important causation is in Indian philosophy, I've started to realize that this is what is perhaps going on there. So I'm trying to explore that dimension. Okay, so you can already see within a Nyaya perceptual theory that there are what are known as positive and negative conditions. So this is all already work that's in Jay Shah's own stuff. And so there is, on the positive side for individuating stuff, the presence of a self, the presence of a properly functioning internal sense organs, the presence of properly functioning external sense organs, contact between the external sense organ and the object, contact between the external sense organ and the internal sense organ, contact between the internal sense organ and the self. And on the negative side, you have not being too far, not being too close, not being overshadowed or covered by a more powerful object, not being mixed up with similar objects. I find the negative conditions very, very interesting. And I think the fact that they posit negative conditions is extremely powerful. And in fact, in my own research on the work of Merleau-Ponty on perception, I find that some of the negative conditions that are articulated square really well with Merleau-Ponty's own work on perception. It's very interesting. I don't think the positive ones square so well, but the negative ones seem to be very interesting. Because one of the key insights that phenomenologists love to make about Merleau-Ponty's work on perception is the idea of the optimal grip in perception. There's a distance where you're seeing it right. That just seems to be not being too far, not being too close, right? So actually you can, I think, derive the result that Merleau-Ponty has about perception directly from the negative conditions inside of the work of the Nyaya. Okay, so going a little bit further, it looks to me like you can also go further into the Nyaya theory and talk about the structure of how they're building things. So in offering a causal theory of perception, the Nyaya also offer a causal account of error, the other side of it, right? So a true perceptual cognition arises due to the satisfaction of both positive causal conditions, the proper functioning of the visual system, and negative causal conditions, such as not being too far away. A false perceptual cognition arises because of a failure in one of the branches, either positive or negative. If the failure is due to something on the negative causal branch, then the failure is due to a defect. And if the failure occurs on the positive causal branch, then the failure is due to an inappropriate causal condition. This is part of the template of what's going on in Nyaya perceptual theory. Now, within Western analytic philosophy, there is a long tradition of giving a causal theory of perception. Perhaps one of the most important people that defended an idea of a causal theory of perception was Paul Grice. I think it was around the 1960s or 1970s. But one of the important differences that I noticed in researching Grice's work is the following. Grice pretty much gives a single factor account of causation. He's saying that there's this one important factor that we need in the theory. But the causal theory that's coming out of Nyaya is far more complex. And in fact, I think it's even more complex than what I've said. But unfortunately, I'm not the gifted person that Jay Shah is that could probably articulate all the details. But it's far more complex. And I think that's an important contribution to be paying attention to. And that's what's driving me to the idea that there's a causal disjunctivism going on inside of the Nyaya perceptual theory. And that causal disjunctivism is not the same as what's going on in the analytic terrain, right? So if we go back one or two slides, I can show you again the ideas. So this is the distinction that's primarily at play right now. This is what I'm trying to say Professor Shah's work can contribute. Okay, that's what I'm saying. There's a Nyaya view. They can intersect with these and compete in a very important way. And now I'm going to try and talk about why I might be wrong. So here, there's obviously objections. No one's going to let you go for free, right? So here are the objections. The collapse problem. So Nilanjan Das is sitting in the back over there, and when I presented my paper at the APA last year around this time, he gave a very powerful objection. And basically his objection was, is the causal disjunctivist view really distinct from the epistemic view? And in fact, when I wrote a paper a long time ago and Matthew read it, he asked me the same question, but he put it in a different voice. Matthew said to me, wait a minute, Anna, I get the causal disjunctivism that you're defending for the Nyaya view, but the problem I see is that the reason why they accept the causal view is because it leads to the truth. So one version is that they collapse. The other version is that there's no reason to accept one because you would want it only for the other, right? So that might be my misunderstanding of the real direction and purpose of Nyaya, but that's sort of the arc that I'm sort of saying. Here's another one. Is the proximality principle true? Here's another one. Is it really consistent with scientific research and vision science? Okay? And then, does it offer anything as a forward-looking project? Can we actually get more out of, by looking at Nyaya, can we get more in other areas? That's kind of where I'm going. Okay, so let's put some real sort of flavor onto what the collapse problem is. So here's one way to see it. The epistemic disjunctivist individuates perceptual states into two kinds, mere appearances and relations to facts. The causal disjunctivist individuates perceptual case into two kinds because they're caused in certain ways, the bad case, caused in the right way, the good case. Now, these two would be different if the epistemic version didn't allow for deviant causal chains, right? So if there's a deviant causal chain, then it could be true, but the causation is wrong, right? And that would be a difference between CD and ED, okay? That would be a difference between the two views. But as Nilanjan has pointed out, John McDowell actually has a passage where he restricts deviant causal chains in a footnote. And by restricting the deviant causal chains, it looks like epistemic disjunctivism and causal disjunctivism are closer. And therefore, Matthew and Stephen, if they're right about the disjunctivist move, are right in claiming that it is disjunctivism in the same sense as what's going on in analytic philosophy. That's basically what would happen to my argument. So that's how the collapse problem goes. OK, so how do we respond to the collapse problem? So I think one thing to do is first to just go back to the causation. Right? Again, so the causal conditions on the side of the Nyaya are positive, negative, and they exclude deviant causal chains. In fact, I think the purpose of the complexity of the causal nexus is to exclude the deviants. The idea is that they're building this very complex theory because they think by building the complex theory, we will exclude the deviants. Now, on the other side, they have positive causal conditions for sure. I have not seen anywhere discussion of negative causal conditions. But given this one footnote that Nilanjan has pointed out, it is true that there is an example where John McDowell excludes a deviant chain. But of course, I would think you got to do more work than just say it in order to bring it closer to what we're arguing. So the first move is just to go back to the causation and say it's still richer on the Nyaya side, so there still is a difference at the causal level about how it's being explained, actually. Okay, but then there's another way to do it. Let's suppose that it's actually correct that because epistemic disjunctivism locks out the deviant causal chains, what we get is in fact that they come in closer together. So then what we'll do is we won't say that we'll individuate it by the causal factor. What we'll do is we'll individuate it by the truth factor, right? So we can go one step further. So if the correspondence theory of truth is what's going on in the Western analytic tradition when they talk about veridicality, then if we don't have the correspondence theory in the Nyaya, then when it's true, we're saying something different, right? We're saying something substantially different. So what are the differences? According to what Professor Shah has told me, here, this looks like some of the things that we might think are the differences. So number one, the Nyaya notion is non-relational. There's no correspondence relation being discussed. Secondarily, truth is a property of cognition. There's no notion of propositional truth. There's no notion of apprehension. Sorry, there is a notion of apprehension. And more interestingly, conjunctive cognitions are not falsified by a false conjunct. I'll explain this in more detail during the questions if we need to. On the epistemic disjunctivist side, we have a different profile. We have a relational correspondence theory of truth. We have the fact that truth is not a property of a cognition. It's a property of a propositional truth. It uses the notion of a proposition to explicate truth. There is no notion of an apprehension that I have seen yet in McDowell's work when he articulates how the epistemic disjunctivism is articulated. And conjunctive cognitions would be arguably falsified by a false conjunct. So there's a profile difference in the way truth is operating. So I think there's another way to sort of block the collapse problem. But then I think there's still this argument that Matthew has, which is, but what is the reason why the Nyaya go in for it? And so there, I have to admit, I don't yet have an answer to the reasons component, but I think there could be the beginning of one right here. It's very clear that Matthew thinks that the Cartesian backdrop is what forms the epistemic disjunctivist position in analytic philosophy. And he thinks it's very important to realize that disjunctivism can be articulated within classical Indian philosophy without the Cartesian backdrop. But if that's true, then the motivations for a Western philosopher to be a disjunctivist is to refute skepticism. And the motivations to go in for disjunctivism in Nyaya philosophy is not to refute skepticism. So refuting skepticism is not the project of defending a certain view of perception. It's a consequence of it. But the importance of defending disjunctivism in analytic philosophy is to break Cartesian skepticism. Therefore, the motivational differences separate. So that's the hypothetical argument I'm making right now. I can't defend it much further than that because I don't know the history of the Nyaya theory of skepticism yet. But some of the stuff that Dr. Senda said the other day about doubt makes me think there's a way to use the theory of doubt to separate the two further. Okay. So then again, we have this issue. Well, a lot of this started because there was this proximality principle that's at play in vision science. Is it really even true, though? It seems like when you go really deep into neuroscience of vision that a lot of people accept something like this. But it might just be because they're interested in something different. They're interested in actually the neuroscience of how information is processed when we perceive things. But it looks like there's a very straightforward argument about why you wouldn't want to accept the proximality principle. And it's basically the following. In a court of law, we care about whether or not you hallucinated the stabbing or you saw the stabbing, because seeing the stabbing is evidence, but hallucinating it isn't. And in fact, in a court of law, providing evidence why someone's vision wasn't very good and therefore they didn't really see it is evidence, right? So the proximality principle seems to be completely irrelevant when we go to the normative domain. And so John Campbell has argued that this is a reason to think that wherever the proximality principle is right, it might not cut at the evidence level. When it comes to the epistemology, it might not be the relevant factor. Something else, it has to come in there also. So that's a motivation to draw proximality by saying it doesn't cut at the epistemic level. It only cuts maybe at the processing level. In fact, also at the processing level, in the paper I wrote in 2013, I argued that there's a way in which the Nyaya can actually intersect in the processing level also and talk about things also. So we can talk about that if you want to. Okay. So then the other thing is, it's different from epistemic disjunctivism. I've just argued that, the Nyaya perceptual theory. Now you might say, but how does it fare with the other view, anti-individualism? I think it's very easy to show that this view, the Nyaya view, is consistent with anti-individualism. Matthew Dostie has written a series of papers, and his papers seem to show a lot of times evidence for parasitism. That's the concept that's used to talk about asymmetric dependence in Nyaya perceptual theory. And in his recent work in 2017, in the Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy on Vatsayana, he again does a lot of work to talk about this issue of parasitism. But the parasitism stuff, that's again, I think that's arguments for asymmetric dependence. So he's absolutely right that you get that. So if it is arguments for asymmetric dependence that Matthew is giving us, then I think what we really get is this very interesting result. That in fact, Matthew's arguments support the view that in fact, the Nyaya perceptual view is consistent with anti-individualism, because asymmetric dependence and anti-individualism fit nicely together. So evidence for asymmetric evidence can infer evidence for anti-individualism. Parasitism is the evidence that we get from the Nyaya perceptual theory, so we should get the result that it holds. Okay, so that's the basic thing, and in my paper I discussed this sort of view. Okay. So I think that just makes it consistent. And then the other thing is, well, what can it offer for vision science? I mean, I think there's a lot more that it can offer, and I have other ideas. But for now, the basic template idea is, well, most of the vision science looks at the positive causal conditions. It doesn't look at the negative causal conditions. So we don't have a lot of discussion of what absence and negative causal conditions can do in the processing. Now, maybe there isn't much there in terms of a forward-looking project. But it doesn't seem to me like that isn't a way to make the initial claim that it isn't inconsistent with providing a forward program. It's consistent with providing a forward program. So I think that's basically where the setup of that part of it goes. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to look at how this conversation, which was primarily about perception, intersects with knowledge. Because the question we were ultimately going to be asking is, what's the relationship between the perception functioning in a certain way and it providing us with knowledge? So I want to not say anything about what I think the Nyaya theory of knowledge is. Rather, I want to give what I think are two profiles. And of course, Amita Chatterjee gave us a third profile yesterday, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But I want to first discuss two profiles that we could talk about. So one view is called non-componential and stack. Okay? So what it means is this, that knowledge is not a hybrid kind. You don't put truth, justification, and belief together as components in addition and get knowledge, right? It's non-componential. That means it's a mental state. It's relational. It hits its target. Okay? It's relational. Okay? In particular, justification is not a component of the non-componential view. Justification operates in the sphere of debate and social exchange. Okay? It is a relevant thing to talk about. It's just not a component of knowledge. No one's saying it's bad. It's just not a component of knowledge. And they operate in different realms. So on this view, justification and knowledge are stacking, right? And knowledge is non-componential. Knowledge is relational, and it feeds into justification, but in a different realm. The other view is more looking like a standard traditional view. So this kind of view actually is a profile that's similar to Timothy Williamson's view coming out of Oxford. So the leading view out of Oxford University, in my understanding, looks like it could be a little bit like a Nyaya view. That's basically another motivation that's driving me. This is kind of Williamson's view, and this is kind of the older, more traditional view in Western philosophy. Knowledge is a derivative state. It's composed out of justification, truth, belief in some anti-Gettier condition. Justification is a component of knowledge. Knowledge is reached when justification has a certain property. So the older sort of modern philosophical view is when, well, you have justification, and when it gets to a certain strength relation, it crosses a certain threshold, then we say you know, right? But, you know, someone might say, okay, do I really want to buy that? Maybe not. Okay, then the last part. There is a single dimension on which knowledge and justification operate. So these two contrast. Because this one is saying knowledge feeds into justification in a stack relation. This one is saying there's a single metric and knowledge is just on a higher end than it. Okay? So the question might be the following. Given the evidence that the scholars here who know about Nyaya have, is there one that it fits more like? Or, and I'm totally happy to go along with this, as Amita says, this is all garbage. The problem is that in English we have concepts like knowledge and justification. But within Sanskrit and developing out of Sanskrit, we have a different set of terms that we need to translate into English to make the case for what that theory is, and that this is sort of a problem. And so I think that might be the right move to make. It's not really my position to say whether that's the right way to go, because people who have more knowledge than me can say something about that. But I think setting it up this way would be a good way to discuss the relationship between the perceptual theory I've defended coming out of the Nyaya in relationship to analytic philosophy and how it could feed into the next step about knowledge. How are we on time? How are we on time? Okay, I guess we won't get... Okay, I think I'll stop there for questions. Okay, thank you.
We'll take the questions at the end.
I just ended.
Yes, after the second lecture.
Okay.
There would be a discussion, interaction period.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So that's...
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Boddo, for an excellent exposition of the situation of the dialogue between the Indian and the Western theories. We now look forward to the presentation by our second speaker, Professor Rupa Bandopadhyay, Professor of Philosophy, Jadavpur University. She would be speaking on the Nyaya and the Advaita theories of erroneous perception. So more of truth and error. Thank you. Rupa. Can you push a bit?
This is a learning session. I am from the other discipline, literature. But I have been in culture studies. I have got your email address. I seek information to get in touch.
Respected Professor Chatterjee, respected Professor Vaidya, respected monks of the Ramakrishna order, my teachers who are present here, I can see Professor Prabal Kumar Sen, who is my teacher, other learned guests, and the distinguished audience. First, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture for inviting me to this very prestigious international seminar to commemorate the 158th birth anniversary of Sister Nivedita. Today I'll be speaking on some traditional theories of erroneous perception. First, I would like to clarify my standpoint. I'd like to speak fully from the traditional perspective, I would like to say that whatever I am saying has been said by the traditional philosophers, and I'll not, while presenting their views, I'll not add any perspective or comment of my own. I shall reserve my own comments and certain parallelisms between the Western and the Indian theories for the end. At first, I shall only present some of the traditional theories entirely from the traditional perspective. The Indian theories of error, as we all know, are known as Khyativadas. They are known as Khyativadas. The term Khyati is derived from the Sanskrit root chaksha with the suffix tin added to it. The Sanskrit root chaksha in Madhaviya Dhatu Vritti is defined as Vaktayang Vati Ayang Darshanepi. That is, the root chaksha can have two meanings. The first meaning is vaktavak, that is an expressed statement. And the second meaning is darshana, or an immediate awareness, an aparuksha jnana. Now, in the meaning of the root chaksha as an expressed or explicit statement, the use of the root in this sense is very common. In fact, this is the more common use of the root chaksha. We have all heard of the famous verse, Achakyu kavayo kechit sampratya chakshate pare akhyasyanti tathaivanye itihasam imang bhuvi. There, the root chaksha is used in the state of saying something. But here, the root chaksha is used to mean an immediate awareness, but not all kinds of immediate awareness. Here it means only an erroneous awareness. So this is not a derivative meaning of the term Khyati. The etymological or the etymological sense of the term Khyati may refer to any immediate awareness. But conventionally, in the Indian tradition, it is used only to stand for an erroneous awareness. So this is the conventional sense or the rudhyartha. And we all know of the principle yogat rudhir bolyosi. That is the rudhyartha or the conventional sense is sometimes stronger than the etymological sense. This is what has happened here. There are many theories of error. Many theories of error were prevalent in the Indian tradition, of which 5 are the principal or the major ones. These 5 are, perhaps other speakers have also referred to these 5 theories of error. These are, first, Akhyatibada, upheld by the Prabhakara Mimamsaka school and the Shankha school. These are the 2 schools who adhere to Akhyatibada. Next, I must refer to Asat Khyatibada, then Atma Khyatibada, Anyatha Khyatibada, and Anirvachaniya Khyatibada. Of course, these theories of error are not the only theories of error. There are other theories as well, such as Viparita Khyatibada of Kumarila Bhatta, Sat Khyatibada of Ramanujacharya, and every recognized school of Indian philosophy has its own Khyatibada or own theory of error. Now, the question which springs to a listener's mind is this: what is the principle of classification which led to so many theories of error? What is the principle of classification behind all these theories of error? First, all the theories of error are divided into under two heads, Akhyatibada and Khyatibada. The principle here is the Pravakara Mimangsaka and the Sankhya theory do not admit any erroneous cognition. For them, all cognitions are veridical. The Pravakara Mimangsakas uphold the principle Sarvam Jnanam Yathartham Eva. That is, all cognitions are veridical. This is a very counterintuitive view. Prima facie, this is a very counterintuitive view, implausible view. Still, the Pravakara Mimangsakas and the Sankhya philosophers adhere to this view. That is, these two theories may be translated as the no illusion theories. The term Akhyati literally means no illusion. They do not accept any kind of erroneous perception. Next, under the next head come all the other theories which believe that there are erroneous perceptions. So they are called the Khyativadas. Still, the Khyativadins differ and have debated a lot among themselves regarding what should be the acceptable theory of error. But the main principle on the basis of which these Khyativadas are classified in our tradition is this: what is the ontological status of the object of error? So all the other schools, they accept erroneous perception, but they debate among themselves regarding the ontic status of the object of error. Now, there can be four logical possibilities. An object can either be real, or it can be unreal, or it can be both real and unreal, and it can be neither real nor unreal. We can show that all the Khyativadas can be shown to be included in either of these four alternatives. First, we come to those philosophies or those doctrines who believe that the object of an erroneous perception is absolutely unreal. The Madhya Vedanta school adheres to this view that the object of an erroneous cognition is absolutely unreal. Tradition ascribes the epithet Asat Khyativada to the Madhya school. But we must note here that the Madhya Vedantins do not call themselves Asat Khyativadins. They call themselves Abhinava Anyatha Khyativadins. This is the word which Acharya Vyasatirtha uses in his text Nayamrita. Abhinava Sabhimata Anyatha Khyativada or Abhimata Anyatha Khyativada. But tradition ascribes the description Asat Khyativada to the Madhya Vedanta school. Tradition also ascribes this epithet to Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Buddhism. Why? Because the Madhyamika school say that there is nothing real, there is nothing unreal. The nature of reality is not real, it's not real, it's not unreal, it's not both real and unreal, and it is also neither real nor unreal, but it is Shunyo or Chatushkoti Vinirmukto. What exactly is the interpretation of this Shunyo? There are debates among the philosophers regarding the nature of Shunyo. I am not exactly going into this debate regarding the nature of Shunyo right now, because that is not the subject matter of my today's presentation. Yet tradition says that Nagarjuna also adheres to Asat Khyativada. Whether this adjective or epithet is justified for them, that's a separate issue. There can be debate about that. The Yogacara Buddhist philosophers believe that the object of an erroneous perception is real. Now, whatever is real can be divided into two classes. First, what is real can be something external to the knowing mind, or it may be somehow internal to the knowing subject. The Yogacharo Buddhist philosophers, they believe that the object of an erroneous cognition is internal to the knowing subject. So their view is known as Atmakhativado. Here, the term Atman is not used to stand for an eternal, changeless self, but it simply means eternal. We shall see, we shall have occasion to refer to their view later also, on their view, but I'm just saying one or two lines about them right now, because time may not permit me to go into the details of Atmakhativado. On the Atmakhativadin's view, the object of an erroneous perception is nothing but the form of a cognition. It's the form of a Vijnana. So that is why they are Vijnanavadins, and their view is known as Atmakhativado. The view that the object of an erroneous perception is neither real nor unreal is not upheld by anybody. At least our tradition, the Vivarana school, thinks that this view is not adhered to by any philosopher. This is the Vivarana classification. All right? But some philosophers have said that Vijnana Bhikshu, the later Sankhya philosopher, the author of the Sankhya Pravachana Bhashya, he adheres to the view that the object of an erroneous perception is both real and unreal. But our teachers think, at least my teacher thinks, that this is not a correct representation of Vijnana views, later Sankhya. This is a misconstrual of Vijnana Bhikshu's view. So my teacher thinks that, my teacher Professor Ashok Kumar Gangopadhyay would say that there is no school which adheres to the view that the object of an erroneous perception is both real and unreal. Now, there are many schools who say that the object of an erroneous perception is real. We have already referred to the classification of real things as Bahya and Antara, the external and internal. The internal alternative is accepted by the Yogachara Buddhists, that is mainly by Dignago, Dharmakirti and their followers, the Yogachara Buddhist school. Now, even if we regard the object of an erroneous perception as external, the external object can again be of two types. It can be situated right in front of the subject, right in front of the erring subject, or it can be situated elsewhere, Atra and Anyatra. Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta accepts the view that the object of an erroneous perception is situated right in front of the subject, so Ramanuja's view is called Satkhativada. All other Khativadins, including the Nyaya, the Kumarilo school, the Bhattamimamsa school of Kumarilo Bhatto, the Yoga school, they adhere to the view that the object of an erroneous perception is situated somewhere else, not in front of the subject. The Nyaya view is called Anyatha Khativada. Kumarilo's view is known as Viparita Khativada. The Yoga philosophers also consider their theory of erroneous perception as Viparita Khativada. Today, I shall be concentrating more on the Nyaya and the Vedanta theories of error, that is on Anyatha Khativada and Anirvachaniya Khativada. But both the Nyaya and the Advaita Vedanta theories of error, the Advaita Vedanta schools have developed their views by criticizing mainly the Pravakara theory of error. So, in the beginning, I shall say a few words on the Pravakara theory as well, to present the main Purvapaksha, the view of the main opponents, whom both the Nayayikas and the Advaita Vedanta Vedantins have criticized in order to develop their own views. Later, I shall also mention that this Advaita theory of error is a cornerstone of Advaita philosophy. The entire rationale, the arguments behind the Advaita philosophy is based on this Anirvachaniya Khativadu. To these points, I shall come back later. The Pravakara philosophers adhere to the theory that there is no erroneous cognition. But immediately one would object that we do encounter many cases where a person mistakes something as something else. Suppose mistakes a rope as a snake, or a piece of or a mother of shell as a piece of silver. Then how would the Pravakara philosophers account for such cases? The first thing, the Pravakara philosophers would say that all errors pertain to action. Cognitions can only be incomplete or inadequate, but they can never go astray. They cannot never present one object as another. Now, the question which next arises is how do the Pravakara philosophers account for a so-called erroneous situation? How would they explain the so-called erroneous situation? The Pravakara philosophers also use the term aparamarthika sthalo. They are not averse to doing that. But they would say that in this aparamarthika sthalo, there is only a brahma vyavaharo, but no brahma jnano, no viparyayo is involved in an aparamarthika sthalo. They would say that the sense organ of the subject comes into contact with something present before him. Because of this sense-object contact, an immediate awareness, a perception of the very general characteristics of the thing in front of the subject is produced. This is a very general characteristic which presents the thing present before the subject as idam or as ayam. That is, it presents it as something which is present here and now, at this point of time and in this place. This general awareness also reveals certain very general characteristics of the object present before the subject, such as in case of the snake rope illusion, it presents the long elongated nature of the thing, that it is a black thing, that it is a carved object. In case of the mother of shell silver illusion, shell silver illusion, it presents the presented object as something which glitters, a piece of thing which is glittery, which reflects light, and so on and so forth. So it presents only certain general characteristics and doesn't present the presented object, doesn't present the object in front of the subject along with its specific characteristic. That is the rajutva of the rope and the and not the sarpatva, the rajutva of the rope and the shuktitva of the shell are not presented. These two characteristics are not presented. That is quite obvious, because if one understands the rope as a rope, then one would not have mistaken it for a snake. If one understands the shell as a shell, one would not have mistaken it for a silver. So the specific characteristics are not presented to the subject. The next question which arises is, why are not the specific characteristics presented? The reason is because of certain defects. The Pravakara philosophers define a defect as karya janana shakti vighatakatvam. It is a property which prevents a thing from producing its own natural effect. For instance, when milk turns sour, milk cannot produce its own natural taste, but milk produces sour taste. So, dosha is not the capacity to produce some new effect. It is some kind of counteracting condition which pratibandhaka, which prevents an entity from producing its own natural effect. Because doshas or the defects can be of three kinds. They can be pramatrigata, they can be indriyogata, and they can be vishayogata. Instances of pramatrigata dosha are desire, aversion, raga, dvesha, etc., lobha, bhayo, etc. The instances of sensory defects are kacho, kamalo, etc., that is bile, cataract, etc. Kamala means bile, jaundiced eye, and kacha means an eye having cataract. And the instances of vishayogata dosha are distance, absence of light, etc. These are the vishayogata doshas. Because of these three kinds of doshas, the specific characteristics of the object are not presented. Because of we have already mentioned, I have already mentioned that certain general characteristics are presented. These presented general characteristics have similarities with certain other general characteristics seen elsewhere. So these general characteristics arouse the memory of some previously seen object. The memory of an earlier seen snake or an earlier seen silver is aroused. Now this memory traces, these samskaras, they lead to a recollection. This recollection, however, is not an ordinary recollection. It's a truncated recollection or a pramushta tattako sriti, where the tat part of the recollection is obliterated. The subject remembers the silver or the snake not as that silver or as that snake, but only as silver and as snake. He doesn't remember its otito kalinatva, its past character, and that it was seen by him at some other place, its distant character. He doesn't remember those properties. Now, so in the erroneous situation, the subject has two distinct cognitions. One is a perception of the general characteristics, the other is a recollection of some distant property. The subject doesn't perceive the distinction between these two cognitions and their objects, and from these two incomplete cognitions an erroneous activity is produced. The subject proceeds to accept the shell as silver, or he flees away from the rope considering it to be a snake. This activity is a determinate one because here the subject treats the thing present in front of him as having some characteristic. So it's a determinate characteristic, but the two cognitions from which this determinate activity arises, none of those two cognitions is a determinate cognition, because none of those two cognitions present a property as residing in a locus. Now, there are certain trite objections which the Neo views presents against the Pravakara philosophers. The Neo philosophers would say that no activity can arise out of Vedagraha, because Vedagraha is a negative entity. No one can act on the basis of non-perception alone. The Pravakara philosophers would say that here the agrihita bhedo jnanodayo, that is the two cognitions of whose distinction the subject was unaware, lead to the erroneous activity. So, no absence. It is not the case that an absence leads to the erroneous activity. Actually, the two cognitions themselves, of whose distinction the subject was unaware, lead to the erroneous activity. Vachaspati Mishra in his Tatparya Tika has brought the most. I now move on to the main Nyaya object because time is very short. I move on to the main Nyaya objection against the Prabhakara thesis. Vachaspati Mishra in his Tatparya Tika has wrote that this Prabhakara view is entirely unacceptable. Why? Because the silver awareness which occurs in an erroneous situation cannot be accepted as a veridical cognition. What is the silver awareness? The silver awareness is Purovarti Vastu Vishayakam. Vivadadhyasitam Rajata Jnanam Purovarti Vishayakam. Purovarti Vastu Vishayakam. This silver awareness is about the thing which is present before the subject. But why is it about the thing present before the subject? Because the subject invariably proceeds towards the thing present before him. He doesn't proceed to the jungle to see to flee from a snake, or he doesn't go to a jewelry shop to accept the silver, to take the silver. He moves in front of the thing to take it, if it is a shell silver illusion. So this cognition, this activity of the subject clearly proves that the Rajata Vijnanam, the Rajata Jnanam is about the presented object. But is the presented object the same as it appears in the subject's awareness? No. So the Prabhakara philosophers must admit that the cognition must have gone astray in presenting its own object. So Vachaspati Mishra is giving this Anumano, this inference, to establish that the disputed silver awareness is about the thing present in front of the subject. The thing in front of the subject is not actually what it appears in the awareness. So one must admit that the awareness has somehow gone astray. So it is a wrong awareness, an incorrect awareness, and the Prabhakara philosophers cannot say that all cognitions are veridical. This is the main argument of Vachaspati Mishra. Vachaspati Mishra would explain the process of error in this manner. He would say that the subject, I am now moving on to the process of Anyatha Khativada. There are differences between the ancient Naiyayikas and Gangesha and his followers regarding the process of Anyatha Khativada. I would mention the distinction in one or two lines. Vachaspati Mishra would say that the subject sense organs come into contact with the object. As a result of this contact, a general awareness of the general characteristics of the object is produced. But the specific characteristics are not revealed. The specific characteristics are not revealed owing to dosha. Up to this point, their account is the same as the account of the Prabhakara philosophers, but the Naiyayikas differ with the Prabhakara philosophers regarding the nature of a defect. The Naiyayikas would say that a defect is that which has the property viparito karyo janakatvam. It produces an effect which the entity cannot produce in its natural state. When it is vitiated by that defect, it produces something contrary, something else. So, viparito karyo janakatvam is the definition of a defect on the Nyaya view. And a dushta indriyo, that is a vitiated sense organ, along with the memory traces, it produces the erroneous cognition. This was the view of the earlier Naiyayikas. This was the view of the earlier Naiyayikas. The earlier Naiyayikas have nowhere talked about jnana, lakshana, sannikarsha. Nowhere. the concept of jnana lakshana, yes sir, sir has an objection. At least Bachespati, Jayanto do not speak of jnana lakshana sannikarsha. Elsewhere. But Jnana Lakshana Sannikarsha in the context of error is first clearly mentioned by Gangesha in his chapter, in the chapter Anyatha Khyatibada. And there Gangesha said very clearly that two things can be the Sannikarsha. That is either the Sriti, the recollection, or the memory traces. This also is something different from the established now view. Today, no Nauyayika could say that the memory traces can act as a Sannikarsha between the distant object and the sense organs of the subject. So, the now view now stands like this, that on having a general cognition and which doesn't reveal the specific characteristics, then owing to the similarity between the perceived general characteristics and the properties of some distant object, the memory traces of the distant object are aroused. Those memory traces themselves may act as the Sannikarsha, as the contact between the sense organ of the subject and the presented object, or those memory traces may lead to a truncated recollection, and that recollection may act as a jnana lakshana sannikarsha between the sense organ of the subject and the distant property and the distant object. Then the subject has a determinate, this is very important, a determinate unitary cognition of the form ayang sarpa or idang rajatam, this is silver, or this is snake. This is a determinate cognition, and this determinate cognition leads to the determinate activity. The Nauyayikas would say that no determinate activity can be produced from any cognition, from any two cognitions which are not themselves determinate. The Nauyayikas also have raised a very important objection against which I do not have much time to refer to, but I will just read out the sloka. This is from Jayanta Bhatta's Nyaya Manjari. Shakaro patat, this is against the Akhyatibadins. Sakaro patat asato na bhanat samvid virodhat artho samvid virodhat artho hetva bhavat dhiyam anashvasa bhayat neshta. Yes. No, this is also referred to by Jayanto. Yes, I am taking this from Nyaya Manjari. Yes, and now Jayanta Bhatta is saying that the Akhyatibadins should fall into all these errors. In fact, I have taken this from your book, sir. Your translation of Nyaya Manjari.
Time, please.
Yes, time.
Yes, that is Nyaya. This is Nyaya.
This is your translation.
Nyaya. Yes, we are in the midst of it. We are in the middle of it.
Dhiyam anashasa bhayat janeshto. Jato sorry, I can't see anything because of this slide. Yato annatha khyati yathartha. So what is Jayanto say? Jayanto is saying that if we accept the Prabhakara view, we'll have to accept Sakaravada, we'll have to accept the view that the object of the perception, erroneous perception, is unreal. We'll have to say that it will be contradictory to our experience, and we shall not be place our credence on any cognition. Now, the more important point is that the Annatha Khyatibadins, they are admitting a determinate cognition, and this determinate cognition that leads to a determinate activity. But to all these objections, the Prabhakara philosophers have a very important reply. They say that you do not understand the nature of the object. I shall come back, if I have time, to this point also. The Prabhakara philosophers say, Ya evartho yasyang samvidhi bhasate vedya sa evo nanyadhi vidyad vedyasya lakshanam. So whatever appears in a cognition is its object. In the Rajato Jnana, it is the silver which appears. So the silver is the object of the silver awareness. The presented object is not the object of the silver awareness. So the silver awareness cannot go astray. This is the reply of the Prabhakara philosophers. The Advaita philosophers would say that, okay, the sense organ of the subject comes into contact with the object, and the subject becomes aware of the general characteristics of the object. He doesn't know the specific characteristics. Because of the similarities, the memory traces of some earlier seen object are aroused. These memory traces work upon, on the Advaita view, everything is consciousness, and avidya covers consciousness from beginningless time, and the object consciousness, that is the ghatavachinna chaitanya or the rajavachinna chaitanya, that is also covered by avidya, and the defects along with the memory traces work upon the avidya that covers object consciousness, and two things are produced at the same time. First, an erroneous cognition is produced and an erroneous object is produced. The erroneous cognition is produced from the antakarana vrittavachinna chaitanya nishtha avidya, that is the avidya which is situated on the antakarana vritti. As we all know that on the Advaita view, whenever we have a perceptual cognition, the mind, antakarana, which is an igneous substance, a toijasa padartha, goes out of the sensory outlet and it assumes the form of the object, and that is called an antakarana vritti, a transformation of the mind, which is a sattva pradhana, pramanajanna parinama of antakarana. That antakarana vritti destroys the covering of avidya, and in the case of a veridical cognition, and in case of an erroneous perception, the avidya which is located in the antakarana vritti, on the antakarana, that transforms itself in the form of the erroneous cognition, and the avidya which covers object consciousness, that transforms itself in the form of an erroneous object which lasts as long as the erroneous cognition lasts. So it is pratitiko, it is also pratibhasiko, because it is falsified or sublated during the waking state of the subject. This is in a nutshell the Advaita process. And against the Nyaya theory of error, Madhusudana expresses his criticism in the Advaita Siddhi in a one-liner. This is only a single line. He says that satya na badhyetu asatya na pratiyetu. That is, if it were real, if the object of an erroneous perception were real, then it would not have been falsified later. And if it were absolutely unreal, then it could not have appeared in an immediate appearance. Whatever is absolutely unreal, such as a golden mountain, a hare's horn, doesn't appear in any immediate awareness. It can appear in immediate awareness. We can draw a hare and put the pictures of two horns on the head of the hare. We can have immediate awareness from a picture. We can have immediate awareness on hearing a description, but we cannot ever have an immediate awareness of a hare's horn or a barren woman's son or a golden mountain. So, satya na badhyetu asatya na pratiyetu. The Naiyayikas would reply that we can have, we are saying that this object of an erroneous cognition is real, but it is not real here. It is real elsewhere. Because of the similarities between the veridical case and the non-veridical case, the memory traces of the relation of inherence are aroused. In the veridical case also, we have a general perception of the substratum as this, and we have a specific perception of snakehood, that is of the property. In the general case, in the veridical case also, the subject doesn't perceive any distinction. The subject is not aware of any distinction. And in the non-veridical case also, the subject is not aware of any distinction. Because of this similarity, the memory trace of samabhaya, the relation of inherence, is aroused. And because of that, one perceives that the distant property inheres in the object which is located in front of the subject. This is the reply given by the Naiyayikos. Yes, the Advaitins, how many minutes, ma'am?
The time is
over. Yes, yes, I'm going to end it.
Actually, it is over.
The Advaitins would say, please explain what is the ontological status of this relation of inherence which appears between the presented substratum and the property that is, you are saying, located elsewhere, the distant property. Is this samabhaya something real or something unreal? There cannot be any real samabhaya between the presented rojju and the distant sarpatva, the distant snakehood. There cannot be any real inherence between the present rope and the distant snakehood. And this samyoga will be, this samabhaya will be falsified later also. So it cannot be real. It cannot be absolutely unreal also, for it is presented, it appears in the immediate awareness. So you are just pushing the problem, shunting the problem one step backward. That will not solve your problem. So you will have to admit non-ordinary, non-physical objects which are neither real nor unreal. And I just end my lecture with a reference to some modern philosophers of mind who believe, who have shown, in fact Tim Crane has shown very clearly that there are philosophers who believe that the object of an erroneous object cannot be an ordinary physical object, because the object presented before the subject doesn't have the property F. The property F belongs to something else. So the object which the subject becomes aware of in the erroneous situation is an object O with the property F. So it can be a sense datum, it can be an idea. If we go back to the old representationalist empiricists, it can be an idea, it can be a sense datum, it can be something else, but definitely it can be a content, but it's definitely not a real physical or real mental object. So it's a non-ordinary object, which is a mental construct. The Advaita Vedantins are also saying that the object of error is a non-ordinary object and it is neither real nor unreal. I end my presentation here.
Thank you, Rupa. We had an excellent session of analyzing in details and greater details in the nuances and the subtler nuances of this scheme of analytical thinking, the Nayavada, and its variants, etc. Now, the time is actually up, but then, to keep to the form, let us have one question for each speaker, one question for Professor Boiddo, and one question for Rupa Bandyopadhyay. Could we have the first one?
Acha, may I ask Rupa Bandyopadhyay?
Yes.
Could you please tell me that this theory of error, it is related with subject, object and their interrelation. And so many theories you have put. Is there any common conclusion among them? And what is the ultimate conclusion? Could you please explain?
There is no ultimate conclusion.
There is, as usual, in philosophy, there is no ultimate conclusion. And all the schools refer to their own theories of error. They have their guru abhiprayos. This anirvachaniya khativada, on the basis of anirvachaniya khativada, Advaitins would establish the presented unreality, the mithatva of the world. So there cannot be any common conclusion, but I have already remarked to the point, referred to the point, that up to a stage the processes are the same. but they differ at the end, towards the end. There is no common conclusion.
Yes, so one question.
Nilanjan.
Yeah. So I had a question for Anand. So that makes everything neat. I actually was wondering about the very last part of your presentation, about the two pictures of knowledge, and so I thought the thing on the left, which you were sort of portraying as the Oxford-style view about knowledge, where knowledge is not factorizable into external and internal conditions. I was thinking that, yes, so that way of, way of characterizing justification might be a sort of might go well with McDowell's view about justification, where it's like justification is a concept which we use to evaluate agents when we have public interactions with them. But I was thinking a more sort of recent time slice of Williamson has a view about justification where knowledge just is justified belief. So knowledge is the norm of belief. So there is no notion of justification independent of knowledge. So I think that goes extremely well with the Nyaya view. So the thought is that...
So this is K equals E?
Not just that, it's K equals JB. So the thought is that it's like no belief is justified unless it is knowledge.
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
So I think that goes very well in general with the Indian way of thinking about the pramanas and the prama, where the idea essentially is that you can't really make a claim unless it is knowledge, unless it is backed by some sort of...
So is this tied to the knowledge account of assertion? Or no, am I just making a mistake?
So my thought will be that it is connected to it, but I think Williamson thinks that, at least, and you might think that, so in the first personal case, belief or an awareness episode is just like an inner assertion. So the thought is that if there is a knowledge norm of assertion, then there has to be a knowledge norm of awareness episode, awareness also.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to update on that. Thank you very much.
Rupa Bandyopadhyay would like to add one point.
I would just like to add that all these theories of perception and perceptual illusion are causal theories. On our view, to this view, all the philosophers would agree that the knowledge is Vasutantru. It's not Purushotantru, which means that whenever the causal conditions of knowledge assemble, knowledge arises. The subject desires it or doesn't desire it, knowledge doesn't depend on the subject's sweet will. If it depended on the subject's will, then we would not have received any unfortunate news. Suppose I made you some news which is not conducive to my well-being right now, but I do not want such news, but we have to receive such news in course of our lives. We have to encounter death, unhappiness, everything. So knowledge doesn't depend on the subject's sweet will. Okay, so knowledge is Vasutantru. It doesn't depend on the subject's will. So all these theories are causal theories. When the causes come together, an erroneous perception is produced. But there is a very important difference between the Mimamsakas on the one hand, the Purva Mimamsakas and the Advaita Vedantins on the one hand, and the Nyaya-Vaisheshika school on the other. The Nyaya-Vaisheshika would say that Arthanishya occurs first. Knowledge is just an artha-pratipatti. It is that which reveals its own object. It doesn't reveal its own veridical character. But both the Mimamsaka systems, they would say that every cognition, apart from revealing its own object, also reveals it itself. It establishes itself as veridical. Knowledge cannot do otherwise, act otherwise. It shows its own object and reveals itself as veridical. So there is a very great debate regarding Pramanyo between the Nyaya-Vaisheshikas and the Mimamsakas. But one cannot go into all debates right now. Knowledge cannot be erroneous. Cognitions can be erroneous on some views, not on all views. We have already referred to the views of the Prabhakaro and the Sankhya, who believe that no cognition can be erroneous.
Thank you, Rupa. Thanks to both the speakers. Thanks to those who raised the questions. And it has been an enormously educative process and a source of satisfaction in the sense that we end the session with a strong feeling, strong wish almost, that it could go on, that we could be floating along the endless discourse. And that is, I believe, the main purpose of arranging such sessions. So that is immensely satisfactory and fruitful that way. And I congratulate both the speakers on their presentations, which stimulated such, you see, such enthusiastic response. Thank you all. Here terminates the first session. We have a tea break now.